The candlelight flickered across the divorce papers as Rob slid them across the white tablecloth, his smile as cold as the untouched champagne in our flutes. 15 years of marriage, and he chose Bella Vista, the same restaurant where he'd proposed, to end it all. The irony wasn't lost on me, though I doubt he'd calculated that particular cruelty. Around us, other couples celebrated anniversaries and special occasions, their laughter creating a soundtrack to my husband's betrayal. But as I looked down at those legal documents, perfectly folded and obviously prepared in advance, I felt something he didn't expect. Not shock, not devastation. Relief. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You see, while Rob thought he was delivering a surprise attack, I'd been expecting this moment for 3 months. The private investigator I'd hired had been worth every penny, and the manila envelope sitting in my car contained enough evidence to turn his calculated ambush into his worst nightmare. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Jessica Williams, and at 38, I thought I knew my husband better than anyone. We'd built what looked like a perfect life in Maple Heights, a suburban neighborhood where manicured lawns and 2-car garages painted the picture of American success. I worked as a senior marketing executive at Sterling Marketing Group, a job I'd climbed to through 15 years of 60-hour weeks and creative campaigns that doubled our clients' revenues. Rob ran Williams & Kane real estate development with his business partner David, specializing in luxury condominiums that dotted the city's skyline like monuments to their ambition. Our house sat on Elm Street, a colonial revival I'd fallen in love with the moment we'd walked through its doors as newlyweds. The morning of our anniversary started like any other day. I woke at 6:30 to find Rob already gone from bed, the shower running in our master bathroom. This had become routine over the past few months. Early mornings, late nights, weekend calls that took him away from family dinners and movie nights we used to treasure. I padded downstairs to make coffee, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors we'd refinished together 3 summers ago. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the vanilla candles I'd lit the night before, trying to recreate some of the romance that seemed to have evaporated from our marriage like morning dew. On the granite countertop sat a card with my name written in Rob's familiar handwriting, and for a moment hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe he'd remembered. Maybe tonight would be different. The card contained a generic anniversary message and dinner reservations for 7 o'clock at Bella Vista. No personal note, no inside joke, no reference to any of the memories we'd built over 15 years. It felt like something a secretary might have picked up and signed for him, though I knew Rob prided himself on handling personal matters personally. That should have been my first clue about what kind of evening he had planned. At Sterling Marketing, I threw myself into preparing for a campaign presentation, grateful for work that demanded my complete attention. My assistant, a sharp young woman named Kelly, brought me coffee around 10 and mentioned that someone had called asking for my schedule. When I pressed for details, she shrugged and said the caller had hung up when she'd asked for identification. Strange, but not strange enough to worry about. I had bigger concerns, like the nagging feeling that my marriage was dissolving and I was powerless to stop it. Lunch came and went with a working meeting about our automotive client's fall campaign. My colleague Marcus joked that I seemed distracted, and I blamed it on anniversary nerves. If only he knew that my nerves had nothing to do with romantic anticipation and everything to do with a growing certainty that my husband was planning something that would change our lives forever. The afternoon crawled by with unusual slowness. Every time my phone buzzed, I expected to see Rob's name, maybe a sweet message about our evening or an apology for being distant lately. Instead, I got client emails, meeting requests, and a text from my best friend Linda asking if we were still on for lunch next week. Normal life continuing while I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for someone to push me off. At 4 o'clock, I decided to call Rob's office. His secretary, Mrs. Henderson, a woman who'd worked for Williams and Kane since before I'd met Rob, answered on the second ring. Her voice carried an odd tension when I asked to speak with him. "He's in meetings all afternoon, Mrs. Williams," she said, using the formal tone she reserved for uncomfortable conversations. "Shall I have him call you back?" Something in her voice made me pause. Mrs. Henderson had always been warm with me, asking about our vacation plans and complimenting my holiday cards. Today, she sounded like she was reading from a script. "That's fine," I said, not wanting to push. "Just tell him I'm looking forward to tonight." The silence that followed lasted a beat too long. "Of course, Mrs. Williams. I'll give him the message." I hung up feeling more unsettled than before. Mrs. Henderson knew about our anniversary. I'd mentioned it last week when I'd stopped by Rob's office to drop off his forgotten lunch. Her reaction felt wrong, like she knew something I didn't. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of forced productivity. I responded to emails, reviewed campaign proposals, and attended a conference call about budget allocations, but my mind kept wandering to Rob's behavior over the past few months. The late nights he blamed on difficult clients. The weekend golf games that stretched into evening dinners with business associates I'd never met. The way he'd started showering immediately when he came home, as if he needed to wash something, away before facing me. There had been other signs too, smaller things that individually seemed insignificant, but together formed a pattern I'd been trying to ignore. New cologne that smelled nothing like the woody scent he'd worn since college. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Henderson, the careful way he'd been treating me like a business associate rather than a wife. Everything pointed to a man who'd already checked out of our marriage and was just waiting for the right moment to make it official. I left the office at 6, giving myself time to go home and change into the dress I'd bought specifically for our anniversary dinner. It was burgundy silk, elegant without being flashy, the kind of outfit that photographed well for what I'd hoped would be, a celebration of 15 years together. Looking at myself in our bedroom mirror, I wondered if I was dressing for a romantic evening or a funeral. The drive to Bella Vista took 20 minutes through downtown traffic. I'd made this trip hundreds of times over the years, for anniversaries, birthdays, celebrations with friends, business dinners when Rob wanted to impress clients. The restaurant held 15 years of memories, from our engagement dinner to the celebration when Rob's first major development project had been approved by the City Planning Commission. I arrived exactly on time, a habit that had served me well in business but sometimes annoyed Rob, who preferred a more relaxed approach to scheduling. The hostess, a young woman I'd seen before but never spoken with, greeted me with professional warmth and led me to our usual table by the window. The view overlooked the city's downtown district, where lights were beginning to twinkle in office buildings as the workday ended. Rob was already seated, studying his phone with the intense focus he usually reserved for important business communications. He looked up when I approached, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He stood to greet me with a brief kiss on the cheek, the kind of perfunctory gesture we'd see from couples who'd been married forever, but had forgotten why they'd fallen in love in the first place. "You look beautiful," he said, and I could hear the careful politeness in his voice. Everything about his demeanor felt rehearsed, as if he'd practiced this conversation in advance. We ordered wine, a bottle of Chianti that we'd shared on our first anniversary, and made small talk about our respective days. Rob mentioned a potential new project, a luxury development that could be his biggest success yet. I told him about the automotive campaign, leaving out my strange conversation with Mrs. Henderson and the growing sense of dread that had followed me all day. The bread arrived, followed by appetizers we'd ordered more out of habit than hunger. Everything felt surreal, like we were actors playing the roles of a married couple celebrating their anniversary while knowing the script called for a very different ending. "Jessica," Rob said as the server cleared our appetizer plates, his tone shifting to something more serious. "There's something we need to discuss." And that's when he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded documents that would change everything. The divorce papers were professionally prepared, clearly the work of an expensive attorney, and completely final in their implications. No suggestion of counseling, no request for separation, no acknowledgement that our marriage might be worth fighting for. As I looked down at those legal documents, illuminated by the romantic candlelight he'd probably requested when making our reservation, I realized that Rob had planned this moment with more care and attention than he'd given our relationship in months. The location, the timing, even the wine selection, everything had been calculated for maximum impact. But as I sat there, surrounded by the soft murmur of other diners celebrating their own special occasions, I felt something Rob had never expected me to feel: power. Because while he thought he was delivering a surprise attack, I was holding all the cards he didn't know existed. Rob's fingers drummed against the white tablecloth as he waited for my reaction, clearly expecting tears, or pleading, or some dramatic scene that would validate his narrative about our failing marriage. Instead, I reached for my wine glass and took a measured sip, buying myself time to process what I was seeing while my mind raced through everything Michael Torres had uncovered over the past 6 weeks. The divorce papers were thorough, I had to give Rob's attorney credit for that. As I flipped through the pages, I could see the careful legal language that would have devastated me 3 months ago, before I'd known about Ashley Chen and the secret credit cards and the conversations at Pinewood Country Club, where my husband had planned my financial destruction with the casual precision of a business deal. "This is quite comprehensive," I said finally, setting the documents aside with the same calm I'd used to review a marketing proposal. "Your attorney must have spent considerable time preparing this." Rob shifted in his chair, clearly thrown by my composure. He'd probably imagined this scene differently, with me breaking down in tears while other diners stared and whispered. Instead, I was treating his ambush like a business meeting, which seemed to unnerve him more than any emotional outburst could have. "Jessica, I know this is difficult," he began, using the patronizing tone he'd perfected during our marriage, whenever he thought he needed to explain something obvious to me. "But we both know this marriage hasn't been working for a long time. We've grown apart. We want different things. And it's better to end this amicably, rather than drag it out." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his perspective for the first time. "When did you first realize we'd grown apart, Rob? I'm curious about your timeline." The question seemed to catch him off guard. He'd clearly prepared for tears and accusations, not analytical inquiries about his decision-making process. "It's been gradual," he said, reaching for his own wine. "Probably over the past year or so. You've been so focused on your career, working those long hours, and I felt like we were becoming strangers living in the same house." It was fascinating to watch him construct his narrative in real time, building a foundation of blame that would justify everything he'd already done. According to Rob's version of events, I was the workaholic who'd neglected our marriage, forcing him to seek companionship elsewhere. The fact that he'd been planning this divorce for months while still accepting my affection and sharing our bed was apparently just a reasonable response to my emotional unavailability. "That's interesting," I said, cutting a small piece of the salmon that had arrived while we'd been talking. "Because I remember asking you several times over the past few months if everything was okay between us. You always assured me it was just work stress." Rob's jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in his carefully composed demeanor. "I was trying to protect your feelings. I didn't want to hurt you unnecessarily." "How thoughtful of you." I kept my voice neutral, even warm, as if I genuinely appreciated his consideration. "So when did you decide that divorce was the best solution? Was there a specific moment or incident that made it clear?" He was getting more uncomfortable by the minute, probably wondering why I wasn't reacting the way he'd expected. The other diners continued their conversations around us, creating a bubble of normalcy that made his betrayal feel even more surreal. Here we were, discussing the end of our 15-year marriage over anniversary dinner, while couples at nearby tables celebrated milestones and special occasions. "It wasn't one specific thing," Rob said carefully. "It was more of a gradual realization that we'd become incompatible. A sudden interest in fitness that had him at the gym 4 mornings a week when he'd never shown interest in exercise before. Credit card statements he'd started receiving at his office instead of our home, claiming it was more convenient for business expenses. The most telling change had been in our physical relationship. We'd never been the couple that couldn't keep their hands off each other, but we'd maintained an intimacy that felt comfortable and genuine. Over the past 6 months, that intimacy had evaporated. He came to bed later, left earlier, and when we did share the same space, he seemed distracted, always checking his phone or finding reasons to be somewhere else. I'd tried addressing it directly several times. Over dinner 2 months ago, I'd asked if everything was okay with us, if there was something we needed to talk about. He'd looked genuinely surprised and assured me that work stress was the only issue. He'd even suggested we plan a romantic getaway, though when I'd brought up specific dates and destinations, he'd always found reasons to postpone. 3 weeks later, I'd tried a different approach, planning a surprise weekend at home with his favorite meals and no distractions. I'd bought new lingerie, lit candles throughout the house, and put together a playlist of songs from our dating years. Rob had seemed appreciative but distant, going through the motions of romance without any real engagement. When I'd asked if he was happy, he'd given me the same reassurance about work stress and promised things would get better after his current project finished. But the project had finished, and nothing had improved. If anything, his distance had become more pronounced. He'd started working weekends, claiming that success in real estate required constant networking and relationship building. When I'd suggested joining him for some of these social events, he'd explained that business dinners were boring, and I'd have more fun staying home with a good book. The breaking point had come 6 weeks ago during what should have been a pleasant Saturday morning. I'd woken to find Rob already dressed and checking his phone, his face lit with the kind of smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. When I'd asked about his plans, he'd mentioned a last-minute client emergency that required immediate attention. The lie had been so smooth, so practiced, that I'd known with absolute certainty that it wasn't the first time he'd used it. That afternoon, while Rob was handling his supposed emergency, I'd made a decision that would change everything. I'd called Torres Investigations, a private investigation firm I'd found through a discreet internet search. Michael Torres had answered the phone himself, his voice carrying the kind of professional warmth that made difficult conversations feel manageable. "I think my husband is having an affair," I'd said, the words feeling strange and shameful in my mouth. "I need to know for sure." Torres had asked practical questions without any judgment or drama. How long had I suspected? What specific behaviors had changed? Did I have access to phone records or credit card statements? His approach had been businesslike and thorough, treating my situation like a puzzle to be solved rather than a personal tragedy to be dramatized. We'd met 2 days later at a coffee shop across town, a place called The Grind, where I was unlikely to run into anyone from our social circle. Torres was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every variation of infidelity and betrayal. He'd explained his process clearly: surveillance, financial record analysis, digital investigation within legal boundaries, and comprehensive documentation of any findings. "I want you to understand," he'd said over his second cup of coffee, "that sometimes people hire me hoping I'll prove their suspicions wrong. If your husband is faithful, I'll find evidence of that too. My job is to discover the truth, whatever that truth might be." I'd appreciated his honesty, though deep in my heart I'd already known what he would find. The retainer fee had been substantial but manageable with my salary, and some money I'd inherited from my father's estate. Rob hadn't questioned the expense when it appeared on our joint account, probably assuming it was related to work or one of the home improvement projects. I was always researching. For 6 weeks, Torres had worked quietly and thoroughly. We'd met twice for updates, both times at the grind. Both times with news that confirmed my worst fears, while somehow making me feel more grounded and less crazy. Rob was indeed having an affair, and it wasn't his first. The current relationship was with Ashley Chen, a 26-year-old yoga instructor and social media influencer who taught classes at FitLife Center, the gym where Rob had suddenly developed his passion for fitness. The affair wasn't casual or recent. Torres had documented 3 months of regular meetings, hotel stays, expensive dinners, and gifts that Rob was financing through a credit card I'd never seen. Ashley's Instagram account, which she kept public despite the nature of her relationship, showed carefully cropped photos of expensive restaurants, designer handbags, and weekend getaways that Rob had claimed were business trips. But the affair was only the beginning of what Torres had discovered. Rob's sudden interest in keeping business and personal finances separate hadn't been about organization or tax purposes. He'd been systematically moving assets, preparing for a divorce he'd been planning for months while still sharing a bed with me and accepting anniversary gifts and birthday surprises. The most damaging evidence was a recording Torres had obtained through legal means, a conversation between Rob and his business partner David at their country club, where Rob had outlined his strategy for leaving me with as little as possible. He'd discussed hiding assets, timing the divorce to coincide with a temporary dip in his business income, and using my work schedule and dedication to my career as evidence that I'd been neglecting our marriage. "She's so focused on her job that she barely notices I'm gone," Rob had said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone discussing a business transaction. "By the time she realizes what's happening, everything will be arranged. Ashley and I are looking at condos in the Riverside district. I figure 6 months from now, this will all be settled and I can start fresh." David had raised concerns about potential complications, but Rob had dismissed them with confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Jessica's too trusting and too busy to see this coming. She'll be hurt, but she'll be reasonable about the settlement. She's always been reasonable." Torres had provided me with copies of financial documents showing the asset transfers, photographs of Rob and Ashley together, credit card statements for expenses related to their relationship, and hotel records spanning back 6 months. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, painting a picture of calculated deception that went far beyond a simple affair. As I sat in my office that anniversary afternoon, I thought about the manila envelope locked in my car's glove compartment. Everything Torres had discovered was organized and ready, but I hadn't decided how to use it. Part of me had hoped that Rob would come to his senses, that he'd end the affair and recommit to our marriage without me ever having to reveal what I knew. I'd imagined confronting him privately, giving him a chance to explain and make things right. But as evening approached and I prepared to meet him at Bella Vista, I had a growing sense that Rob had already made his choice about how this would end. The formal tone of his anniversary card, the strange conversation with Mrs. "We want different things out of life." "What different things?" I asked, genuinely curious to hear how he'd rationalize his affair and financial deception as a philosophical difference about life goals. Rob seemed to realize he was being interrogated, rather than comforted, and his expression hardened. "Jessica, I didn't bring you here to debate the reasons for our divorce. I'm trying to handle this like mature adults. The papers spell out a fair settlement that recognizes both of our contributions to the marriage." I glanced down at the documents, again, noting the carefully crafted language that would leave me with significantly less than half of our assets, while Rob kept the bulk of his business interests and the properties he'd been quietly transferring to accounts I wasn't supposed to know about. It was a masterpiece of legal manipulation disguised as fairness. "I see you've proposed keeping the house," I observed, flipping to the property settlement page. "That's generous of you, considering how much you've always loved that place." "It makes sense for you to stay there," Rob said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when explaining real estate deals to clients. "It's familiar, comfortable, and the mortgage is manageable on your salary. I don't need that much space anymore." Of course he didn't need that much space. According to Michael Torres's surveillance reports, Rob had been spending most nights at Ashley's apartment in the Riverside district anyway. He'd probably been planning to move in with her permanently once our divorce was finalized, though I doubted he'd shared that detail with his attorney or his family. "And you're proposing to keep your business interests separate," I continued, reading through the financial terms. "That seems fair, since Williams and Kane was established before our marriage." Rob relaxed slightly, probably thinking I was accepting his terms without argument. "Exactly. We both built successful careers during our marriage, so it makes sense for each of us to keep what we've earned individually." It was almost admirable, the way he'd constructed a narrative that painted his systematic deception as mutual independence. According to his version of events, we'd simply grown into different people who deserved to pursue separate paths. The fact that his path included a 26-year-old girlfriend and a luxury condo purchased with money he'd hidden from me was apparently just coincidental. "What about the investment account from my father's estate?" I asked, noting that it wasn't mentioned anywhere in the settlement proposal. "I don't see that listed in the asset division." Rob's pause lasted a fraction too long. "That was your inheritance. It should stay with you, obviously." Except that according to Michael Torres's financial investigation, Rob had been systematically borrowing against that account for the past 8 months, using the funds to finance his relationship with Ashley and prepare for his new life. The loans were structured as temporary business investments, but the money had gone toward hotel rooms, expensive dinners, jewelry, and a security deposit on the Riverside District condo where he planned to start fresh. "That's very considerate," I said, making a mental note to ask Pat Morrison, my attorney, about the legal implications of using marital assets to finance an extramarital affair. "I appreciate you being so thoughtful about protecting my father's legacy." The server appeared to refill our wine glasses and ask about dessert, creating a brief intermission in our surreal conversation. Rob declined dessert, probably eager to finish this scene and move on to whatever celebration he'd planned with Ashley. I ordered tiramisu, partly because I was genuinely hungry, and partly because it would extend our dinner long enough for me to gather more information about his plans. "So, what happens next?" I asked once the server had left. "Do I need to sign these tonight, or do I have time to review them with an attorney?" "You should definitely have your own lawyer look them over," Rob said, his relief evident that I was treating this as a straightforward business transaction. "I want you to feel comfortable with every aspect of the settlement. My attorney recommended Patricia Morrison if you need a referral. She has an excellent reputation for handling divorces professionally." I almost laughed at that. Patricia Morrison had been my attorney for 6 weeks already, ever since Michael Torres had provided enough evidence to convince me that Rob's late nights and weekend emergencies weren't related to legitimate business. Pat had been preparing for this exact moment, building a case that would expose every lie Rob had told and every asset he'd tried to hide. "Pat Morrison," I repeated, as if considering the suggestion. "I'll give her a call tomorrow. How long do these things usually take?" "If we can agree on terms quickly, probably 3 to 6 months, Rob said. "Neither of us wants to drag this out unnecessarily. The sooner we can finalize everything, the sooner we can both move on with our lives." Move on with their lives. As if our 15-year marriage was just a business partnership that had run its course, rather than a commitment he'd systematically betrayed while planning his escape. But I kept my expression neutral, nodding as if his timeline seemed reasonable. "Have you told anyone else about this yet?" I asked. "Your family, David, anyone at work?" Another pause, longer this time. I mentioned to David that we were having some difficulties, and I spoke with my mother last week about the possibility of divorce. So Margaret Williams already knew her son was planning to leave me. which explained the strained conversation. When I'd called her 2 weeks ago to confirm Thanksgiving plans, she'd been polite but distant, clearly uncomfortable with maintaining our relationship while knowing what Rob was planning. I wondered if she also knew about Ashley, or if Rob had sold her the same story about our growing apart due to my career. Focus. "What did your mother say?" I asked, genuinely curious about how Rob had presented his case to the woman who'd welcomed me into their family with such warmth 15 years ago. "She understands that marriages sometimes end," Rob said, carefully. When I answered, his voice carried a mixture of shock, anger, and something that might have been respect. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "I'm coming home early tonight, and we need to discuss what happened today." "Of course," I replied with the same calm tone I'd used throughout our anniversary dinner. "I'll be here whenever you're ready to talk." The conversation was brief, but I could hear the beginning of panic in Rob's voice. He'd spent months planning a divorce that would proceed on his terms, with his timeline, according to his preferred narrative. Instead, he was facing emergency hearings, asset freezes, and the possibility that his financial misconduct would be exposed in public court proceedings. More importantly, he was beginning to realize that the wife he'd underestimated for 15 years had been several steps ahead of him throughout his carefully orchestrated betrayal. The evidence Pat had filed would prove that Rob's narrative of mutual incompatibility was actually a story of calculated deception, financial fraud, and systematic preparation for abandoning his marriage while protecting his own interests. As I waited for Rob to come home that evening, I thought about the conversation we were about to have and how different it would be from the one he'd planned. This time, I would be the one setting the terms and controlling the narrative. This time, Rob would be the one scrambling to respond to evidence he couldn't deny or explain away. The manila envelope that had sat in my glove compartment for weeks was no longer my secret weapon. It had become the foundation of a legal strategy that would expose every lie Rob had told and every asset he'd tried to hide. His calculated betrayal was about to become his biggest mistake, and the wife he'd dismissed as naive and trusting was about to teach him a lesson about the cost of underestimating someone who'd been paying very close attention. Rob walked through our front door at 6:15 that evening, looking like a man who'd been hit by a freight train he never saw coming. His usual confident stride had been replaced by the uncertain gait of someone whose world had shifted fundamentally in the span of a single afternoon. Gone was the satisfied smile he'd worn that morning while discussing his divorce strategy with his attorney. In its place was the haunted expression of a man realizing that his carefully laid plans had been built on completely false assumptions. I was waiting in the living room, sitting in the wingback chair that had belonged to my grandmother, the same chair where I'd spent countless evenings reading while Rob worked late or attended his supposed business functions. The irony of the location wasn't lost on me as he stood in the doorway, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the legal documents that had destroyed his morning. "How long have you known?" he asked without any greeting or preamble, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone who'd moved beyond anger into a kind of numbed shock. "Known about what specifically?" I replied, maintaining the same composed demeanor that had served me so well throughout this entire ordeal. "About Ashley? About the hidden bank accounts? About the conversations at Pinewood Country Club where you planned how to cheat me out of everything we'd built together?" Rob's face went even paler, if that was possible. He'd clearly hoped that somehow the evidence against him was incomplete, that maybe I'd discovered one aspect of his deception, but not the full extent of his betrayal. The realization that I knew everything, had documented everything, and had been quietly building a case while he congratulated himself on his cleverness hit him like a physical blow. "Jesus, Jessica," he whispered, sinking onto the couch across from me. "How did you find out about the club conversations?" "Does it matter?" I asked calmly. "The question isn't how I found out, Rob. The question is why you thought you could get away with it." He stared at me for a long moment, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. The woman he'd dismissed as naive and trusting had systematically documented every aspect of his deception, while maintaining the perfect facade of an unsuspecting wife. The realization that he'd been completely outmaneuvered by someone he'd underestimated was written across his face in expressions that shifted from shock to anger to something approaching fear. "The private investigator," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You hired Michael Torres." I nodded, impressed despite everything that he'd managed to identify the source of his downfall so quickly. 3 months ago, after I found the hotel receipts in your jacket pocket. The ones from the Grand Plaza that coincided with your supposed client emergencies. Rob buried his face in his hands, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the cruel satisfaction in his voice when he'd served me divorce papers at our anniversary dinner, the way he'd bragged to Ashley about how reasonable and compliant I'd been, and any sympathy I might have felt evaporated. Completely. "God, I'm such an idiot," he muttered through his fingers. "I thought I was being so careful, so clever. I had it all planned out perfectly." "You did have it planned out," I agreed. "The problem is that you planned it based on a completely false understanding of who you were dealing with. You assumed I was the same trusting woman you married 15 years ago, someone who would accept whatever you told me without question." Rob looked up at me then, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "What do you want, Jessica? What's it going to take to make this go away?" The question revealed so much about how Rob's mind worked, how he'd always approached problems throughout our marriage. Everything was negotiable, everything had a price, and every conflict could be resolved through the right combination of charm and financial incentives. He still didn't understand that this wasn't a business transaction that could be settled with the right offer. "Make what go away?" I asked. "Your affair with Ashley? The money you've stolen from our joint accounts? The lies you've told everyone about why our marriage failed? The fact that you used our anniversary dinner to serve me with divorce papers, while bragging to your girlfriend about how easy it was going to be to manipulate me?" Each item on my list hit him like a separate blow, and I could see him physically recoil as I laid out the full scope of what he'd done. This wasn't just about one mistake or one moment of weakness. She wants both of us to be happy, even if that means being happy apart. I doubted Margaret Williams had been quite that philosophical about her son's decision to abandon his marriage for a woman young enough to be his daughter. But Rob had always been skilled at presenting information in ways that supported his preferred narrative. He'd probably emphasized my work schedule and our lack of children, painting a picture of a marriage that had simply faded rather than one he'd actively destroyed. The tiramisu arrived, giving me another few minutes to process everything I'd learned. Rob's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Present me with divorce papers at a romantic location where I'd be too emotional to think clearly. Offer a settlement that seemed fair on the surface, but actually protected his interests, and rely on my trusting nature to accept his version of events without digging deeper. It might have worked too, if I hadn't spent 6 weeks learning exactly how much he'd underestimated me. Michael Torres had uncovered not just Rob's affair with Ashley, but a pattern of financial deception that stretched back over a year. The business trips that were actually romantic getaways, the client dinners that were dates, the investment opportunities that were jewelry purchases and luxury hotel stays. But perhaps most damaging was the evidence Torres had gathered about Rob's conversations with David Kane and other business associates. Rob hadn't just planned to leave me. He'd bragged about how easy it would be. He'd described me as naive and trusting, someone who would accept whatever settlement he offered because I was too decent to fight dirty. "You've been very quiet," Rob observed as I finished my dessert. "I know this is a lot to process." "It is," I agreed. 15 years is a long time to just walk away from. "We're not walking away from anything meaningful," Rob said, leaning forward with the earnest expression he used when trying to close difficult real estate deals. "We're acknowledging that we've become different people who want different things. There's no shame in admitting that what worked when we were younger doesn't work anymore." I wondered if Ashley Chen would still find him appealing when she learned about his casual attitude toward commitment and his willingness to abandon relationships when they required actual effort. Rob seemed to think he was trading up to a younger, more exciting version of married life, but he was really just revealing his own character to anyone paying attention. "You mentioned that you've been thinking about this for a while," I said. "Have you been seeing someone else?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke from the restaurant's candles. Rob's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tiny tightening around his eyes that told me everything I needed to know even before he answered. "I think it's better if we focus on our own relationship rather than speculating about other people," he said finally. "That's not really an answer, Rob." "It's the only answer you're going to get tonight." His voice carried an edge of irritation, probably because I wasn't following the script he'd imagined for this conversation. "What matters is that our marriage is over, and we need to handle the practical aspects of ending it." I nodded slowly, as if accepting his non-answer as sufficient. But inside, I was cataloging every evasion and half-truth for the conversation I'd be having with Pat Morrison tomorrow morning. Rob thought he was protecting Ashley by not mentioning her name, but he was actually providing more evidence of his deception. "I suppose you're right," I said, signaling the server for our check. "There's no point in rehashing what went wrong. Better to focus on moving forward." Rob seemed relieved that I was finally accepting his narrative. He reached for his wallet, probably planning to pay for our anniversary dinner with the same credit card he'd used to finance his affair. The irony was almost too perfect, using our joint finances to pay for the meal where he'd served me divorce papers. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this," he said as we waited for the check. "I was worried you might take it personally." Take it personally, as if the end of our marriage was a business transaction that shouldn't involve emotions or personal feelings. But I just smiled and agreed that handling things professionally was the mature approach. The drive home was silent, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Rob was probably planning his new life with Ashley, calculating how quickly he could move out and start fresh. I was thinking about the manila envelope in my glove compartment and the conversation I'd be having with Pat Morrison in the morning. Back at our house on Elm Street, Rob went straight to his home office, claiming he had emails to catch up on. I went upstairs to our bedroom and changed out of the burgundy dress I'd bought for our anniversary celebration. As I hung it in the closet, I wondered if this would be the last time I'd wear something specifically for Rob, the last time I'd dress up hoping to please the man who'd promised to love me for better or worse. I could hear him moving around downstairs, probably texting Ashley about how smoothly everything had gone. He'd managed to serve me divorce papers without any drama, and I'd accepted his settlement terms without argument. From his perspective, the evening had been a complete success. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to Rob shower in our bathroom before settling into his side of the mattress we'd shared for 15 years, I wasn't thinking about endings. I was thinking about beginnings, and about how surprised he was going to be when he learned that his reasonable, trusting wife had been several steps ahead of him all along. Tomorrow, Pat Morrison and I would begin turning Michael Torres's evidence into a legal strategy that would expose every lie Rob had told and every asset he'd tried to hide. The private investigator had done his job thoroughly, documenting not just Rob's affair, but his systematic preparation for a divorce that would leave me with as little as possible while he started fresh with Ashley. Rob had made one crucial miscalculation in his carefully planned betrayal. He'd assumed that, because I'd trusted him during our marriage, I would continue to trust him during our divorce. He'd counted on my decency and naivety to accept whatever settlement he offered, grateful that he was handling things so professionally. Instead, his betrayal had taught me something valuable about protection and preparation. While he'd been planning his escape, I'd been building a case that would ensure his calculated cruelty backfired spectacularly. The evidence Michael Torres had gathered would transform Rob's narrative of mutual incompatibility into a story of deliberate deception and financial fraud. As I drifted off to sleep, I could hear Rob's phone buzzing with text messages in the darkness. Probably Ashley, eager to hear how his wife had reacted to the divorce papers. I wondered what he was telling her about our conversation, whether he was describing my calm acceptance as evidence of how little our marriage had meant to me. He would learn soon enough that my composure hadn't been acceptance. It had been the quiet confidence of someone holding all the cards in a game the other player didn't even realize he was losing. Public service creates additional pressure and prevents him from claiming he never received the documents. It also sends a message about how seriously we're taking his attempts to defraud you. The next phase of our strategy involved coordinating with Michael Torres to gather additional evidence while Rob was still operating under the assumption that his plan was working perfectly. Torres would continue surveillance, documenting any attempts Rob made to move assets or destroy evidence. He'd also monitor Ashley's social media activities, capturing any posts that might reveal information about their future plans. "Your husband has made several critical errors," Pat summarized as our meeting concluded. "He's assumed you're naive and trusting. He's left a comprehensive paper trail of his misconduct. And he's chosen a mistress who documents their relationship publicly. Most importantly, he's so confident in his strategy that he's not taking basic precautions to protect himself." I left Pat's office feeling energized in a way I hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since discovering Rob's betrayal, I wasn't just reacting to his deceptions. I was actively working to expose them, using his own overconfidence and carelessness against him. The evidence Torres had gathered would transform Rob's narrative of mutual incompatibility into a story of calculated fraud and betrayal. That evening, Rob came home later than usual, claiming he'd been showing properties to potential investors. He seemed relaxed and cheerful, probably because he believed the most difficult part of our divorce was behind him. Over dinner, he made casual conversation about his day, mentioning that David Kane had expressed concern about how I was handling the divorce news. "I told him you were being very reasonable about everything," Rob said, cutting into his steak with the satisfied air of someone whose plans were proceeding smoothly. "David was worried there might be complications, but I assured him you understood that this was the best solution for both of us." I nodded sympathetically, playing the role of the understanding wife who'd accepted her husband's decision with grace and maturity. "I appreciate you speaking with David. I know this affects the business relationships you've built." "That's exactly what I mean," Rob said, his voice warming with approval. "You've always understood the practical aspects of these situations. That's one of the things I've always respected about you." It was fascinating to watch him rewrite our history in real time, transforming his betrayal into a mutual decision. That reflected well on both of us. According to Rob's revised narrative, I was being reasonable and mature rather than devastated and naive. He was handling a difficult situation with sensitivity rather than serving me divorce papers during our anniversary dinner. "Have you had a chance to contact Pat Morrison yet?" he asked, probably eager to ensure that I was represented by the attorney he'd recommended. "I called her office today," I said truthfully. "We're meeting tomorrow to discuss the settlement terms." Rob's relief was visible. In his mind, everything was proceeding exactly as planned. I was consulting with the attorney he'd suggested, accepting the settlement he'd proposed, and handling the entire situation with the compliance he'd expected. He had no idea that Pat Morrison had been preparing for this divorce longer than he had, or that tomorrow's meeting would focus on exposing his financial fraud rather than negotiating his proposed terms. After dinner, Rob retreated to his home office for what he claimed was business correspondence, though I suspected he was actually coordinating with Ashley about their future plans. I could hear him talking on the phone, his voice carrying the intimate tone he'd once used with me during our early dating years. Now that he'd served me with divorce papers, he apparently felt free to conduct his affair more openly, at least within the privacy of our home. I spent the evening reviewing the evidence Pat had given me, studying the financial documents and surveillance reports that revealed the full extent of Rob's deception. The paper trail was comprehensive and damning, showing not just his affair with Ashley, but his systematic preparation for a divorce that would leave me with as little as possible. The most infuriating discovery was a document Torres had uncovered showing that Rob had consulted with 3 different attorneys over the past 6 months, shopping for legal representation that would help him minimize his financial exposure. He'd eventually settled on a lawyer known for aggressive tactics in high-asset divorces, someone who specialized in protecting wealthy clients from what they considered unreasonable demands from their spouses. But Rob's attorney had been working with incomplete information, building a strategy based on Rob's assurances that I was financially naive and unlikely to mount sophisticated opposition. The settlement proposal that had seemed generous at Bella Vista would crumble once Pat demonstrated how much wealth Rob had been hiding and how much he'd spent on his affair. The next morning brought another overheard phone conversation, this time with Rob's attorney discussing timeline and logistics for finalizing our divorce. Rob was pushing for an accelerated schedule, probably eager to marry Ashley and start his new life without the complications of ongoing legal proceedings. "She's agreed to everything," I heard him say as he dressed for work. "Pat Morrison is handling her representation, but there shouldn't be any issues. Morrison has a reputation for being thorough but reasonable. She'll make sure Jessica understands the settlement terms, but she won't create unnecessary complications." I had to admire his confidence, even as I prepared to destroy it completely. Rob was so certain that he'd outmaneuvered me that he was actually providing his attorney with inaccurate information about the opposition he'd be facing. When Pat Morrison revealed the evidence we'd been gathering, Rob's lawyer would realize that his client had been lying about virtually every aspect of the case. At 10 o'clock that morning, while Rob was conducting his regular Thursday staff meeting at Williams & Kane, a process server walked into the conference room and delivered a stack of legal documents that would shatter his carefully constructed narrative. The emergency motions Pat had filed would freeze all joint assets, demand immediate disclosure of business financial records, and request hearings on issues ranging from asset dissipation to fraud. But the document that would hit Rob hardest was the one Pat had titled Motion for Discovery and Sanctions Based on Systematic Concealment of Assets and Marital Misconduct. It contained a comprehensive summary of everything Michael Torres had discovered, from Rob's affair with Ashley, to his conversations about hiding assets, to his use of joint funds to finance his extramarital relationship. Pat called me 20 minutes after the service was completed, her voice bubbling with satisfaction. "He's been served with everything we discussed, plus a few additional motions I filed this morning. According to the process server, your husband went completely white when he realized what he was reading." The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving Rob exactly 4 days to prepare a response to evidence he didn't know existed. His attorney would be scrambling to understand how their straightforward divorce case had suddenly become a complex fraud investigation, while Rob would be forced to explain why he'd lied about virtually every aspect of his financial situation. "How long do you think it will take him to call?" I asked Pat, genuinely curious about Rob's likely reaction to discovering that his reasonable, trusting wife had been building a case against him for months. "Based on my experience with cases like this, probably about 6 hours, Pat replied. "First, he'll try to understand what went wrong with his strategy. Then he'll realize that you've known about Ashley all along. Finally, he'll start calculating how much this is going to cost him, both financially and professionally." Pat's prediction proved remarkably accurate. At exactly 4:30 that afternoon, my phone rang with Rob's name on the caller ID. The morning after our anniversary dinner, I woke to find Rob's side of the bed empty and cold, the sheets barely disturbed from where he'd slept on the very edge of the mattress. Through the bathroom door, I could hear the shower running and his voice speaking quietly into his phone. Even through the sound of water, I caught fragments of his conversation that made my stomach tighten with a mixture of disgust and satisfaction. "It went perfectly," he was saying, his voice carrying the self-congratulatory tone he used after closing a particularly lucrative real estate deal. She was completely reasonable about everything. No tears, no arguments, just accepted it like I knew she would. I slipped out of bed and moved closer to the bathroom door, not to eavesdrop, but to confirm what I already suspected. Rob was reporting back to Ashley about how successfully he'd ambushed me with divorce papers, probably reassuring her that his wife had been as naive and compliant as he'd predicted. "The settlement is generous," he continued, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "She gets the house, I keep the business assets, and we can probably have this wrapped up in a few months. Pat Morrison will handle her legal representation, so there won't be any complications." I had to press my hand against my mouth to keep from laughing out loud. Rob actually believed that his recommendation of Pat Morrison as my attorney was a stroke of genius, ensuring that I'd have competent but not aggressive representation. He had no idea that Pat had been my lawyer for 6 weeks already, building a case that would expose every aspect of his deception. After Rob left for work, I called Pat's office and moved up our scheduled meeting to that afternoon. Her secretary, a sharp woman named Helen who'd been fielding calls from suspicious wives for 20 years, fit me into Pat's calendar with the efficiency of someone who understood that timing was crucial in divorce proceedings. The offices of Morrison and Associates occupied the top floor of a downtown building that offered panoramic views of the city Rob and his partner had helped reshape with their luxury developments. Pat Morrison herself was a woman in her late 50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of penetrating gaze that made lying seem pointless. She'd built her reputation on complex divorce cases where significant assets were at stake, and she had a particular talent for uncovering hidden financial arrangements. "So he finally made his move," Pat said, as I settled into the chair across from her mahogany desk. "Tell me everything about last night, and don't leave out any details, no matter how insignificant they might seem." I walked her through the entire evening, from Rob's carefully orchestrated choice of location to his patronizing explanations about why our marriage had failed. Pat made notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking questions that revealed how thoroughly she'd already analyzed the divorce papers Rob had presented. "The settlement he's proposing is interesting," she said, flipping through the documents. "On the surface, it appears generous. You keep the family home, which has significant equity, and he's not claiming any portion of your salary or pension benefits. But look at what he's protecting." She spread out a financial analysis that Michael Torres had prepared, showing the real value of Rob's business interests and the assets he'd been systematically moving out of joint accounts. The settlement that had seemed fair over dinner revealed itself as a calculated attempt to leave me with the illusion of security, while Rob walked away with the bulk of our actual wealth. Williams and Kane. Real estate development is worth significantly more than the value he's declared, Pat explained, pointing to incorporation documents and tax filings that Torres had obtained through public records. "They've got 3 major projects in development, plus a portfolio of rental properties that generate substantial monthly income. The business valuation in his settlement proposal is based on outdated figures that don't reflect current market conditions. But the business assets were only part of the story." Pat opened a second folder containing bank statements, credit card records, and investment account summaries that painted a picture of systematic financial preparation for divorce. Over the past 18 months, Rob had been moving money out of our joint accounts and into investments that would be difficult to trace or value. "He's been very clever about this," Pat admitted with something that might have been professional admiration. "The money movements are structured to look like legitimate business investments or temporary loans. If you hadn't hired Michael Torres to investigate, we might never have discovered the full extent of what he's been doing." The most damaging evidence, though, was the documentation of how Rob had been funding his relationship with Ashley Chen. Credit card statements showed a pattern of expensive dinners, hotel stays, jewelry purchases, and travel expenses that coincided perfectly with the timeline Torres had established for their affair. Rob had been using our joint finances to court another woman while lying to me about working late and attending business functions. This creates several legal issues for him, Pat explained, making notes about potential fraud and breach of fiduciary duty claims. When spouses use marital assets to fund extramarital relationships, it's considered dissipation of marital property. The court can order reimbursement and adjust the final settlement to account for the misused funds. Even more problematic, for Rob was the evidence Torres had gathered about his conversations with David Kane and other business associates. The recordings captured Rob explicitly discussing his plans to hide assets and minimize his financial exposure in the divorce. In one particularly damaging conversation, Rob had bragged about how easy it would be to manipulate me into accepting an unfavorable settlement. "He's essentially confessed to fraud," Pat said, reviewing the transcript of Rob's conversation at Pinewood Country Club. "He's admitted to deliberately concealing assets and misrepresenting the value of his business interests. This kind of evidence can transform a routine divorce into a case involving punitive damages." We spent 2 hours reviewing every aspect of the evidence Torres had compiled, and Pat's excitement was barely contained as she realized the strength of our position. Rob had been so focused on executing his plan that he'd failed to consider how his own actions would appear under legal scrutiny. Every lie he'd told, every asset he'd hidden, every conversation he'd had about manipulating me had been documented and could be used against him. "I want to file a motion for emergency hearings on several issues," Pat said, outlining her strategy. "First, we'll seek to freeze all joint assets and prevent any further transfers. Second, we'll request immediate discovery of all business records and financial statements. Third, we'll ask for temporary support that reflects his actual income, rather than the reduced figures he's been reporting." But the most devastating element of Pat's strategy involved Ashley Chen herself. While Rob had been careful not to mention her name in his conversations about the divorce, Ashley had been considerably less discreet on social media. Her Instagram account contained months of carefully curated posts about expensive dinners, luxury vacations, and designer gifts that could be directly linked to charges on Rob's credit cards. "She's essentially created a photographic record of how your husband has been spending marital assets," Pat explained, showing me printouts of Ashley's posts. "Every restaurant check, every piece of jewelry, every hotel stay can be documented and valued. She's been so eager to show off her lifestyle that she's provided us with evidence we never could have obtained through traditional discovery." The irony was perfect. Rob had chosen Ashley partly because of her youth and social media presence, probably enjoying the way she documented their relationship for her followers. He'd encouraged her to post about their adventures, never considering that her online bragging would create a permanent record of his financial misconduct. Pat's plan involved serving Rob with multiple legal documents simultaneously, creating a coordinated attack that would expose every aspect of his deception while he was still congratulating himself on how smoothly the divorce was proceeding. The timing would be crucial, striking before he could take steps to further hide assets or prepare counter-strategies. "I want to serve him at his office," Pat said with a smile that suggested she'd orchestrated similar surprises before. "A few accounts?" I laughed. "Rob, according to the forensic analysis my attorney prepared, you use joint accounts for 94% of expenses related to Ashley. Hotels, restaurants, jewelry, travel, even the security deposit on the apartment you plan to share with her." Ashley's panic was now complete as she realized her affair had made her a participant in financial fraud. "What does this mean for me legally?" "It means you'll be called as a witness in our divorce proceedings," I explained calmly. "You'll need to testify about every gift and expense Rob provided. You'll need documentation of everything he bought, and you might be required to return items purchased with marital funds." "But I didn't know," Ashley said desperately. "Your Instagram posts suggest you were aware of how expensive things had become." I replied. It'll be difficult to convince. A judge you believed a middle-aged real estate developer could afford thousands monthly without using marital assets. Rob stood up, probably realizing Ashley's presence was creating additional problems. Ashley, you should leave. This isn't something you need to be involved in. I'm already involved, Ashley shouted. According to Jessica, I'm going to be dragged into court to explain our entire relationship. How am I not involved? The argument that followed revealed how much Rob had concealed from Ashley about his situation. She'd believed his divorce would be simple and amicable, clearing the way for their relationship without complications. The reality of legal scrutiny, having her social media used as evidence, and potentially returning expensive gifts was something she'd never considered. You told me your wife was okay with everything, Ashley accused. You said she understood the marriage was over and wanted to end things peacefully. That's what I thought would happen, Rob said weakly. I believed Jessica would be reasonable about the settlement. Reasonable? Ashley's voice rose. You mean you thought she'd let you steal her money to spend on me and then accept whatever you decided to give her? Ashley's understanding was evolving rapidly. She was finally grasping that her relationship had been built on lies and financial fraud, and that Rob's promises about their future had been based on completely unrealistic assumptions about how his divorce would proceed. I need to call my parents, Ashley said suddenly. I need to understand what kind of legal trouble I might be in. That's very wise, I agreed. You should also consult with an attorney who specializes in asset dissipation cases. There might be ways to minimize your exposure if you cooperate fully with the proceedings. Ashley stared at me with what looked like grudging respect. You've known about everything all along, haven't you? The whole time Rob thought he was fooling you, you were building a case against him. I've known about your relationship for 4 months, I confirmed. I hired a private investigator who documented every aspect of Rob's deception, including his use of marital funds to finance your affair. And you just let him think he was getting away with it? Ashley asked. I gathered evidence methodically, I corrected. I prepared for exactly this situation because I knew Rob would try to end our marriage in a way that protected his interests while leaving me vulnerable. Ashley looked at Rob with new eyes. You really thought you could steal from your wife and get away with it? I wasn't stealing, Rob protested without conviction. I was going to make sure Jessica was taken care of. The settlement I proposed was generous. Generous? Ashley's laugh was bitter. You were planning to leave her with 30% while keeping the valuable assets and using her money to finance our relationship. How is that generous? Rob's phone rang with an urgent call from his attorney. From his expression, it was clear his lawyer was calling with bad news about the evidence Pat Morrison had filed. I can't talk now, Rob said into the phone, glancing nervously between Ashley and me. I'm dealing with a situation at home. But his attorney wasn't willing to wait. I could hear raised voices as Rob's lawyer explained additional legal problems that had emerged since yesterday's filing. The conversation was brief, but obviously devastating. What did he say? Ashley asked with dread. The emergency hearing Monday is more complicated than expected, Rob admitted. The evidence Jessica's attorney filed creates potential criminal liability for some of the financial transactions. Criminal liability? Ashley's voice was nearly a shriek. What kind of criminal liability? Fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, potentially theft, Rob recited flatly. This was about a systematic campaign of deception that had turned our entire marriage into a lie. I never meant for it to happen this way, he said, falling back on the classic excuse of the unfaithful spouse. It just sort of evolved over time. Ashley and I connected, and I realized that you and I had grown apart, and I thought the best thing would be to end things cleanly. Cleanly? I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. You call spending 18 months moving our assets into accounts I couldn't access, using our joint credit cards to finance your affair, and planning to leave me with a fraction of what we'd built together, ending things cleanly? Rob's attorney had clearly briefed him on the extent of the evidence against him, because he didn't even try to deny the financial misconduct. Instead, he shifted tactics, appealing to the history we'd shared and the relationship he'd spent the past year systematically destroying. "We were happy once," he said, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he'd perfected during years of real estate negotiations. "We built something good together, Jess. Don't let this destroy all of that." "You already destroyed it, Rob. The moment you decided that Ashley Chen was worth more than 15 years of marriage. The moment you started planning how to cheat me out of everything we'd worked for together. I'm not destroying anything. I'm just refusing to pretend that what you did was acceptable." The conversation was interrupted by Rob's phone buzzing, with what sounded like an urgent call. He glanced at the screen, and I saw David Kane's name displayed. His business partner was probably calling to discuss the implications of the legal documents that had been served that afternoon, wondering how their carefully structured business arrangements might be affected by Rob's personal scandals. "I need to take this," Rob said, standing and moving toward his home office. "Take it here," I replied firmly. "I think I have a right to hear how you plan to explain this situation to David." Rob hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of conducting business conversations in front of the wife whose trust he'd systematically betrayed. But he was in no position to argue, so he answered the call with me sitting less than 10 feet away. "David, I know you're concerned about what happened today," Rob began, his voice carefully controlled. "Let me explain what we're dealing with here." I could hear David's voice through the phone, raised and agitated in a way that suggested he was less than pleased about having process servers show up at their office during a staff meeting. The conversation that followed revealed just how much Rob had concealed from his business partner about the extent of his personal problems. "You told me Jessica was being reasonable about the divorce," David's voice carried clearly across the room. "You said she'd accepted your settlement offer and that everything would be wrapped up quietly. Now I've got lawyers calling about asset freezes and discovery motions, and I'm reading documents that make it sound like you've been running some kind of criminal enterprise." "It's not as bad as it looks," Rob said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Jessica hired an aggressive attorney who's trying to make this more complicated than it needs to be. We can handle this." "Handle this?" David's voice rose another octave. "Rob, these documents are claiming that you've been using business accounts to fund personal expenses. They're talking about fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Do you have any idea what this could do to our reputation if it goes public?" I watched Rob's face as he realized that his personal scandal was about to become a professional catastrophe. Williams & Kane Real Estate Development had built its reputation on trust and integrity, marketing itself to high-end clients who valued discretion and reliability. The revelation that one of the founding partners had been systematically deceiving his wife and misappropriating marital assets would be devastating to their business relationships. "David, I can explain everything," Rob said, his voice taking on the desperate edge of someone whose entire world was collapsing. "The personal expenses were loans that I was planning to repay. The asset transfers were legitimate business investments. Jessica's attorney is mischaracterizing everything to make it look worse than it actually is." But David Kane hadn't built a successful real estate development company by accepting explanations that didn't add up. The questions he asked over the next 20 minutes revealed that he'd been completely unaware of Rob's personal problems and had been operating under the assumption that his business partner was handling his divorce responsibly and ethically. "I need to see all the financial records," David said finally. "Every transaction, every account, every document that might be relevant to these allegations. If there's any truth to what Jessica's attorney is claiming, we need to start damage control immediately." "There's no need for damage control," Rob protested. "This is a personal matter that won't affect the business." "Rob," You used company credit cards to pay for hotel rooms where you were conducting an extramarital affair. You moved business funds into personal accounts without proper documentation. You had conversations at our country club about hiding assets from your wife. How exactly is that not going to affect our business? The conversation ended with David demanding a meeting first thing the next morning to review all financial records and assess the potential impact on their business relationships. After Rob hung up, he sat in silence for several minutes, probably calculating the full extent of the damage his personal choices had caused to every aspect of his life. David's going to want to dissolve the partnership, he said finally, stating, what we both knew was inevitable. Can you blame him? I asked. You've jeopardized everything he's worked for because you couldn't resist a 26-year-old yoga instructor. What did you think was going to happen when this all came out? I thought it wouldn't come out, Rob admitted. I thought you'd accept the settlement offer and we'd both move on with our lives. I never expected you to fight back like this. That admission revealed everything about how Rob had viewed our marriage and how little he'd actually known about the woman he'd lived with for 15 years. I replied with the same measured calm I'd maintained throughout this entire ordeal. Where else would I be on a Monday evening? Ashley's eyes darted between Rob and me, clearly struggling to understand a dynamic that didn't match any of the scenarios she'd prepared herself for during the drive over. In her imagination, I was probably supposed to be either a broken woman weeping over the ruins of my marriage or a vengeful fury screaming accusations about adultery and betrayal. The reality of finding me sitting peacefully in my own home, engaged in what appeared to be a civilized conversation with my cheating husband, obviously didn't align with her expectations. Rob said you were taking everything really well, Ashley ventured, her voice carrying the uncertain tone of someone testing potentially dangerous waters. He told me you were being incredibly mature about the whole situation and that you understood why your marriage needed to end. Is that what he told you? I asked, allowing my gaze to shift momentarily to Rob, who looked like he was calculating whether our front window was large enough for a dramatic escape. How fascinating. What other details did Rob share about our anniversary dinner conversation? Ashley's confusion deepened as she began to realize that she'd walked into something far more complex than Rob had prepared her for. He said you'd reviewed the divorce papers and accepted the terms without any arguments. He made it sound like you were both going to work with the same lawyer to keep everything simple, and that the whole process would be wrapped up in just a few months. I nodded thoughtfully, as if genuinely considering her summary of Rob's narrative. And how did that make you feel, Ashley? Learning that the wife Rob was leaving was being so cooperative about stepping aside for you? The question caught her completely off guard, probably because no one had ever asked her to examine the moral implications of her affair from my perspective. People involved in extramarital relationships generally prefer to avoid thinking too deeply about the human wreckage their choices create, and Ashley had clearly been operating under the comfortable assumption that I was somehow complicit in my own abandonment. I guess I felt relieved, she admitted after a long pause. I didn't want there to be drama or complications. Rob had explained that you'd both realized the marriage wasn't working, and that ending things peacefully was best for everyone. How wonderfully convenient, I observed, allowing just enough irony to creep into my voice. It must have made your relationship so much more enjoyable, knowing his wife was simply going to disappear quietly without causing any inconvenient scenes. Ashley's discomfort was becoming increasingly apparent, and she kept glancing at Rob with desperate expressions, clearly hoping he would rescue her from this conversation. But Rob appeared to have lost the ability to form coherent words, sitting frozen on our couch like someone who'd just realized that a situation they thought they controlled was actually spiraling completely beyond their influence. Maybe I should go, Ashley said, finally recognizing that she'd stumbled into something she didn't understand. This seems like something you two should handle privately. Actually, I think you should stay, I said calmly, reaching for the comprehensive folder Pat Morrison had prepared for exactly this type of encounter. Since you're such an important part of what's been happening in this marriage, it seems appropriate that you understand what's really been going on. I could see Rob's face drain of color as he realized what I might be about to reveal. He'd clearly kept Ashley completely ignorant about the legal tsunami that was about to destroy his carefully constructed plans. "Ashley, I'm curious about something," I said conversationally. "When did you first learn that Rob was married?" "I knew from the beginning," Ashley said defensively. "Rob was always honest about being married. He told me the marriage was already over emotionally, even if it wasn't legally finished yet. He said you'd both grown apart and that staying together was just making everyone miserable." "How transparent of him," I replied, opening the folder and spreading out the first set of documents. "And when he took you to the Grand Plaza for those romantic weekends, did he mention he was paying for them with credit cards attached to joint accounts that included my money?" Ashley's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "What do you mean?" "I mean every expensive dinner, every piece of jewelry, every hotel room where you conducted your affair was paid for with funds that belonged to both of us," I explained patiently. "In legal terms, that's called dissipation of marital assets. It's fraud." Rob finally found his voice. "Jessica, there's no need to drag Ashley into the technical aspects of our finances. She wasn't responsible for understanding how our accounts were structured." "Wasn't she?" I asked, reaching for another section of documents. "Because according to her very public Instagram posts, she was quite aware of how expensive her lifestyle with Rob had become." I spread out the comprehensive collection of printouts Michael Torres had prepared, each one dated and cross-referenced with financial records. The evidence was overwhelming, showing a clear pattern of expensive gifts and experiences that corresponded perfectly with charges on Rob's credit cards. "This post from 12 weeks ago shows you wearing a diamond bracelet that cost $4,700, I said, pointing to a photograph. "Rob purchased it with our joint Visa card on the same day he told me he was working late on a difficult property deal." Ashley stared at the evidence with growing horror, probably realizing for the first time that her social media presence had created a permanent record of Rob's financial fraud. Every post about expensive restaurants and designer gifts was now evidence in legal proceedings. "I didn't know he was using joint accounts," Ashley protested weakly. "Did you think it was his personal money when he took you to that spa weekend in Napa Valley?" I asked, flipping to more photographs. "The one that cost over $8,000 during the same weekend I thought he was at a business conference?" The color drained from Ashley's face as she grasped what she'd become involved in. This wasn't just an affair between consenting adults. This was systematic deception involving lies to spouses, manipulation of finances, and apparently deceiving Ashley herself about where the money was coming from. "Rob, you told me you had separate accounts," Ashley said, turning to him with hurt and anger. "You said your finances were completely independent from your wife's." "They mostly were," Rob said desperately. "There were just a few joint accounts for household expenses. I never meant for it to become this complicated. How do you respond to these allegations?" Rob's attorney attempted a defense based on the complexity of modern marriage and difficulty determining joint versus separate property. But Pat's evidence was too comprehensive and well documented to dismiss with legal technicalities. "Your Honor," Pat said, presenting our case, "the evidence demonstrates that Mr. Williams engaged in a deliberate campaign to defraud his wife of marital assets while planning a divorce that would leave her with minimal financial security. This isn't typical marital difficulty. This is premeditated fraud." The financial records Torres had uncovered told an undeniable story. Credit card statements showing expensive dinners and hotel stays when Rob claimed to be working late. Bank transfers documenting systematic movement of funds from joint accounts to personal investments only Rob could access. Documentation of gifts and expenses related to his affair, all funded with marital assets. Most damaging were the audio recordings Torres had obtained legally. capturing Rob's own voice outlining his strategy for leaving the marriage with maximum wealth, while ensuring I'd be grateful for whatever minimal settlement he offered. The defendant has admitted in recorded conversations that he deliberately concealed assets and misrepresented his financial situation to minimize obligations to his wife, Pat continued. This isn't disputed interpretation. This is documented evidence of fraud in the defendant's own words. Judge Hawkins asked pointed questions about the timeline of Rob's deception, the extent of dissipated marital assets, and his attempts to conceal business valuations. Rob's attorney struggled to provide explanations that would minimize the legal implications, but the evidence was overwhelming. "Mr. Williams," Judge Hawkins said finally, "the evidence suggests conduct extending far beyond marital discord. The systematic concealment of assets, documented use of marital funds for extramarital relationships, and recorded discussions about defrauding your wife constitute serious misconduct this court cannot ignore." The judge's ruling was devastating. For Rob, all joint assets were frozen pending complete forensic audit. Rob was ordered to provide detailed documentation of every significant transaction over 3 years. Most importantly, he had to immediately return all funds moved from joint accounts, plus interest and penalties. Furthermore, Judge Hawkins continued, given evidence of asset dissipation through the defendant's extramarital relationship, this court orders complete forensic accounting of all related expenses. Any inappropriately used funds will be reimbursed to the marital estate and deducted from defendant's final settlement share. But the judge wasn't finished. "Mr. Williams, your conduct demonstrates deception and misconduct, raising questions about criminal liability. I'm ordering the court clerk to forward all evidence to the district attorney's office for review." The mention of criminal charges visibly shocked Rob, who probably never considered his marital misconduct could result in prosecution. His attorney immediately requested recess to confer, probably explaining the serious implications of criminal referral. Ashley was called to testify about gifts and expenses Rob had provided during their relationship. Her testimony was uncomfortable, torn between protecting Rob and protecting herself from fraud accusations. When Pat showed her Instagram posts documenting expensive gifts and experiences, Ashley's composure cracked. "I didn't know the money wasn't his," she said through tears. "He told me he had separate accounts and his wife wouldn't be affected by what he spent on me." "But you were aware the expenses were significant?" Pat asked. "Yes, but I thought he was successful enough to afford it," Ashley replied, barely audibly. "I never questioned where the money came from because he seemed so confident about his finances." Pat's cross-examination revealed how willfully blind Ashley had been to obvious signs that Rob's spending exceeded his legitimate means. The forensic accounting would eventually show Rob had spent over $78,000 on his affair, virtually all from accounts including my contributions. The hearing concluded with Judge Hawkins ordering comprehensive review of all records and scheduling follow-up proceedings for the criminal referral and final settlement. Rob left looking like someone who finally grasped his complete legal and financial jeopardy. Over the following months, Rob's situation deteriorated, as consequences cascaded through every aspect of his life. David Kane moved to dissolve their partnership, citing reputational damage from Rob's legal troubles. Major clients canceled contracts, unwilling to associate with someone under fraud investigation. The business dissolution revealed additional problems Rob had hidden even from his partner. Several projects were over budget due to cost overruns Rob had concealed through creative accounting. The professional consequences extended throughout the real estate community, as news of Rob's troubles spread rapidly through industry networks. Within 2 months, Rob was essentially blacklisted from major development projects, as potential clients decided association with him represented unacceptable reputational risk. The district attorney ultimately decided not to pursue criminal charges after comprehensive review, but the threat had hung over Rob throughout the proceedings, affecting his ability to negotiate and limiting his legal options. His attorney had been forced into purely defensive strategy, focusing on damage control rather than advancing Rob's interests. Ashley's cooperation proved more comprehensive and damaging than anticipated. She provided detailed documentation of every gift and expense, revealing not only the scope of Rob's spending, but his systematic lies about his financial situation and ability to afford such expenditures. Most damaging was Ashley's disclosure of conversations where Rob had discussed his divorce strategy, bragging about how easy it would be to manipulate me into accepting unfavorable terms, describing me as too trusting to mount effective opposition. Ashley ultimately returned expensive items purchased with marital funds, including jewelry worth over $18,000. The forensic accounting traced purchases directly to joint accounts, making her possession legally problematic regardless of claimed ignorance. The final divorce settlement was dramatically different from Rob's original offer. After accounting for concealed assets, dissipated funds, legal fees, and court penalties, Rob's share was reduced to 26% of total marital value. The house on Elm Street became mine, along with comprehensive financial package including substantial alimony and portion of his business interests. Forensic accounting revealed our estate was worth nearly twice what Rob had claimed, due to hidden assets and undervalued holdings he'd tried to conceal. More importantly, I'd discovered personal reserves of strength and strategic thinking I'd never known I possessed. The woman who'd sat quietly while her husband planned her destruction had evolved into someone who could protect herself and emerge from betrayal stronger than before. Margaret visited one final time before the divorce was finalized, bringing a handwritten apology and family heirloom she insisted I keep despite the marriage's end. The antique jewelry box had belonged to Rob's grandmother, intended for the woman he'd spent his life with. "You were the daughter I never had," she said, through tears. "I'm sorry Robert destroyed something that should have been treasured forever." Rob eventually found work with a smaller firm at significantly reduced pay. His reputation was so damaged he was essentially starting over in an industry where trust and integrity are fundamental. The confident businessman who'd served me divorce papers had been replaced by someone older, more subdued, and less certain about his future. We maintained no contact beyond required legal matters. Occasionally, I'd hear he was struggling with his reduced circumstances and damaged reputation. The marketing consulting firm I'd dreamed of became reality 10 months after divorce finalization. Using my settlement, experience, and strategic skills developed during proceedings, I built a successful business helping companies develop brand identity and reach new markets. The work was rewarding in ways my corporate position never provided, and I found satisfaction building something entirely mine, free from the complications and deceptions that had characterized my marriage. Clients appreciated my strategic approach and ability to identify opportunities others missed, skills honed during months of carefully planning my response to Rob's betrayal. Pat Morrison became not just my attorney but genuine friend, someone who understood the strength required to fight back against systematic deception. She occasionally referred other clients, women who'd discovered their marriages were built on lies and needed help rebuilding independence. "You've become legendary in certain circles," Pat told me during lunch. Women ask specifically about the case where the wife was so prepared she completely turned the tables. "Your story inspires women who thought they were powerless." Michael Torres continued sending updates about other cases, usually women who'd hired him after discovering suspicious behavior. His business had grown significantly, partly from referrals from attorneys who'd heard about the comprehensive evidence he'd gathered in my case. "Your case perfectly demonstrated how preparation and documentation can transform outcomes," Torres explained during a follow-up meeting. "Most people approach divorce from emotional crisis and damage control. You treated it like strategic business. Challenge? Gathering intelligence and building comprehensive case before your husband realized he was in a fight." 3 years after our anniversary dinner at Bella Vista, I received a wedding invitation that made me smile. Ashley was marrying her yoga instructor, someone her age who shared her interests and honest income level. The invitation included a note expressing gratitude for helping her understand the difference between love and financial manipulation. "I know this sounds strange," Ashley wrote, "but I'm grateful everything happened as it did. I learned so much about myself and what I want in relationships. I'm marrying someone who loves me for who I am, not someone who sees me as a trophy or way to feel young again." The invitation represented closure I hadn't expected. Ashley had learned from mistakes and moved forward to build something healthier and authentic. Her growth suggested even painful experiences could lead to positive outcomes if people were willing to learn and make better choices. Rob's attempts to rebuild were less successful, according to occasional reports. He'd tried online dating, but found women his age uninterested in someone with his history, while younger women had learned about his reputation through social media and professional networks. His financial situation remained precarious, with ongoing alimony, legal fees, and restitution consuming significant portions of his reduced income. 4 years after divorce, I was invited to speak at a women's business conference about building and protecting successful enterprises. During Q&A, a woman asked about keeping business and personal finances separate, mentioning her husband thought she was being paranoid about maintaining independent accounts. "My ex-husband said the same thing," I replied, drawing knowing laughter. "Right up until he tried claiming half of everything I'd built while hiding his own assets." Trust your instincts about financial protection. Independence isn't paranoia, it's fundamental business sense. The consulting business continued growing, eventually employing 16 people and serving clients across multiple industries. The strategic thinking skills developed during divorce proceedings proved invaluable in helping businesses navigate challenges and identify opportunities competitors might miss. Most importantly, I discovered that quiet strength inherited from my grandmother, combined with careful preparation and professional support, could overcome even the most calculated attempts at deception and manipulation. The woman Rob had dismissed as too trusting had proven capable of strategic thinking that ultimately exceeded his own supposed business acumen. The anniversary dinner at Bella Vista, that was supposed to mark my marriage's end, had actually marked the beginning of something far more valuable. I'd discovered personal resources and capabilities I'd never known existed, and built a life more authentic and satisfying than anything I'd experienced during 15 years of marriage. Rob had calculated that his reasonable wife would accept whatever arrangement he proposed, grateful for any security he provided. Instead, he learned that underestimating someone based on kindness and trust was a fundamental mistake that could destroy everything he'd worked to build. The private investigator's evidence, attorney's strategy, and court's response had combined to create justice that felt both appropriate and complete. But more than financial vindication, the experience had revealed personal strengths and strategic capabilities that continued serving me in every aspect of life. 6 years after Rob served divorce papers during our anniversary dinner, I celebrated my consulting firm's anniversary with clients, employees, and friends who'd supported me throughout rebuilding. The success I'd achieved was entirely my own, built on foundations of honesty, hard work, and ethical practices rather than deception and manipulation. During the celebration, Pat offered a toast that perfectly captured the transformation since that evening at Bella Vista, when I'd sat calmly while my husband attempted to destroy my security and dignity. "To Jessica," she said, raising her champagne glass, "who proved the most effective revenge isn't getting even. It's getting better, getting stronger, and getting exactly what you deserve through your own efforts." The woman who'd sat quietly at Bella Vista while her husband served divorce papers had been neither naive nor unprepared. She'd been strategic, patient, and ultimately far more capable of protecting herself than anyone, including herself, had realized. When Rob thought he was delivering a devastating surprise, he'd actually walked into a carefully prepared response that would expose every aspect of his deception while protecting the woman he'd tried to destroy. Sometimes the most powerful response to calculated betrayal isn't immediate retaliation or emotional confrontation. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical preparation that ensures justice becomes inevitable, and the person who tried to manipulate you discovers they've orchestrated their own comprehensive downfall. Rob's anniversary surprise had been designed to demonstrate his power and control over our relationship's ending. Instead, it became the moment he learned that the woman he'd underestimated for 15 years was actually several steps ahead, thoroughly prepared for exactly the kind of betrayal he thought he was executing so cleverly. The divorce papers he'd served with such satisfaction had become the trigger for his own downfall, while the woman he'd characterized as too trusting had emerged stronger, more successful, and more accomplished than ever before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. He'd seen me as a convenient partner who would accept whatever arrangement he proposed, grateful for whatever scraps of security he was willing to provide. The possibility that I might have my own sources of strength and support, my own capacity for strategic thinking, had never occurred to him. "What happens now?" he asked, and there was something almost childlike in the question, as if he genuinely didn't understand the consequences of his actions. "Now you face the reality of what you've done," I replied. "You're going to court on Monday to explain to a judge why you thought it was acceptable to steal from your wife to finance your affair. You're going to deal with the professional consequences of using your business reputation to facilitate personal fraud. And you're going to discover that the woman you thought you could manipulate and discard actually has her own plans for how this story ends." Rob's phone buzzed again, this time with a text message that he read with visible dread. From his expression, I suspected it was from Ashley, probably wondering why he hadn't called to update her on how his divorce was proceeding. The girlfriend, who'd been so eager to document their relationship on social media, was about to learn that her involvement with a married man was going to be examined in detail by lawyers and judges. "Ashley doesn't know about any of this," Rob said quietly. "She thinks we're just waiting for the divorce to be finalized so we can be together openly." "Ashley is about to get a very comprehensive education about the legal system," I replied. "She's going to be called as a witness to testify about the gifts you bought her with marital funds. Her social media posts are going to be entered as evidence of asset dissipation. She's going to discover that being the other woman isn't as glamorous as she thought when it involves depositions and court appearances." The look of horror on Rob's face suggested that he was finally beginning to understand the full scope of what he'd set in motion. This wasn't going to be a quiet, dignified divorce that he could explain away as mutual incompatibility. This was going to be a public examination of his character and conduct, with evidence that would expose every aspect of his betrayal. "Is there any way to avoid the court hearing?" he asked desperately. "Any way to settle this privately?" "There. Might have been," I admitted. "If you'd been honest with me from the beginning. If you'd come to me when you first realized you were unhappy and wanted to work on our problems together. If you'd ended our marriage with dignity instead of serving me divorce papers at our anniversary dinner while bragging about how easy it was going to be to cheat me." "I'll give you anything you want," Rob said, his voice breaking slightly. "Keep the house, take half the business, whatever you think is fair. Just don't let this go to court." But Rob still didn't understand that this had moved beyond negotiations about money and property. This was about justice, about consequences, about ensuring that his calculated cruelty didn't go unpunished. The evidence Michael Torres had gathered, and Pat Morrison had organized into a legal strategy, wasn't just about protecting my financial interests. It was about holding Rob accountable for the systematic way he'd betrayed our marriage while planning to leave me with as little as possible. "The time for making deals passed when you decided to humiliate me at Bella Vista," I told him. "When you spent our anniversary dinner explaining how reasonable I was being about accepting your betrayal. When you used our joint credit cards to pay for the meal where you served me divorce papers." Rob looked at me with something approaching recognition, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. The quiet, accommodating wife he'd taken for granted had been replaced by someone who was prepared to fight for what she deserved. The woman he'd dismissed as too trusting and naive to oppose him had been building a case that would expose every aspect of his deception. "I never meant to hurt you this badly," he said, and for the first time since he'd walked through the door, his voice carried what sounded like genuine remorse. "Yes, you did," I replied calmly. "You meant to hurt me just enough to make me grateful for whatever settlement you offered. You wanted me to feel vulnerable and dependent so I wouldn't question your terms. You calculated exactly how much pain would make me compliant, and you were wrong about how much I could handle." The conversation was interrupted by the doorbell, followed immediately by urgent knocking. Through the front window, I could see Ashley Chen standing on our porch, her face flushed with emotion and her designer handbag clutched tightly in both hands. Apparently, she'd gotten tired of waiting for Rob to update her on the day's developments and had decided to get answers in person. Rob looked at me with panic in his eyes, clearly torn between his desire to protect Ashley from the ugly reality of their situation and his need to minimize the additional damage her presence might cause. But it was too late for damage control. Ashley had chosen to insert herself directly into the middle of a legal proceeding that would examine every aspect of their relationship in forensic detail. "I think your girlfriend wants to talk," I said, gesturing toward the door. "This should be interesting." Ashley Chen exploded through our front door like a force of nature wrapped in expensive fabric, her designer heels creating an aggressive staccato rhythm against the hardwood floors that spoke of barely contained rage and mounting confusion. Everything about her screamed privilege and entitlement, from the perfectly styled platinum blonde hair that caught the light just so, to the flawless makeup that probably took an hour to apply, to the outfit that cost more than most people earned in a month. She was the living embodiment of someone who had never been told no, never faced real consequences, and never been forced to confront the reality that her actions might affect other people in devastating ways. The Chanel handbag clutched in her manicured fingers probably cost more than some people's cars, and her cashmere coat draped over her shoulders like a declaration of wealth that someone else had funded. Every element of her appearance had been carefully calculated to project success, sophistication, and the kind of confident sexuality that men like Rob found irresistible when they reached a certain age and started questioning the choices they'd made in their youth. "Rob, what in God's name is happening?" she demanded, her voice pitched at a frequency that suggested she'd been building up steam during the entire drive from whatever luxury apartment Rob had been financing for her. "I've been trying to reach you for the past 3 hours, and your phone keeps going directly to voicemail. When I finally managed to get through to your office, that ancient woman who answers your phones practically slammed the receiver down when I mentioned who I was, and David Kane hung up on me the moment I said your name." She was so completely absorbed in her own emotional turmoil and her catalog of grievances against the various people who had failed to accommodate her immediate needs that she initially missed my presence in the room entirely. I remained seated in my grandmother's antique chair, positioned where I could observe this performance with the detached interest of someone watching a particularly dramatic television show. When Ashley finally registered that she wasn't alone with Rob, her expression underwent a remarkable transformation that would have been amusing if the circumstances weren't so serious. Surprise flickered across her features first, followed rapidly by confusion, then something that might have been shame before settling into the kind of defensive aggression that people adopt when they know they're caught doing something wrong, but aren't ready to accept responsibility. "Oh," she said, her voice dropping from its previous volume to something approaching a whisper. "I wasn't expecting you to be here." "In my own living room?" When spouses systematically conceal assets and use marital funds for extramarital relationships, it can be prosecuted criminally. Ashley stared at him in horror, realizing her affair had potentially made her an accessory to criminal fraud. The glamorous relationship she documented on social media was revealed as a criminal enterprise funded with stolen money. "I have to leave now," Ashley said, grabbing her handbag and heading for the door. I need to call my parents and find a lawyer. I cannot be involved in criminal activity." "You're already involved," Rob called desperately. "We can figure this out together if we present a united front." But Ashley was already out the door, running to her car. The young woman who thought she'd won a successful older man had discovered she'd become involved with someone whose problems could destroy her own future. After Ashley's exit, Rob and I sat in silence. The house felt eerily quiet after the emotional chaos, and I could see Rob struggling to process the complete collapse of his plans. "She's going to cooperate with your attorney, isn't she?" Robbie asked quietly. "Almost certainly," I replied. "Ashley's young but not stupid. She'll realize her best chance of avoiding consequences is full cooperation with the proceedings." Rob buried his face in his hands. "What have I done? You systematically betrayed our marriage while planning to defraud me of everything we'd built together," I said matter-of-factly. "You used joint funds to finance an affair with someone young enough to be your daughter. You lied to your business partner, your family, your attorney, and even Ashley about your true situation." "I never meant for it to go this far," Rob said. "Yes, you did," I replied firmly. "Every step was deliberate. You didn't accidentally move assets to accounts I couldn't access. You didn't accidentally use joint cards for your affair. You didn't accidentally serve me divorce papers at our anniversary dinner. Every aspect was planned and executed precisely." The next hours brought desperate phone calls as Rob tried to explain his situation to his attorney, business partner David Kane, and eventually his mother Margaret. I could hear him struggling to minimize his culpability, but the evidence was too comprehensive to explain away. Margaret Williams arrived around 10 that evening, looking older than her 73 years and clearly devastated by what she'd learned about her son's behavior. She'd always treated me with genuine warmth during our marriage, and I could see the anguish in her eyes as she struggled to understand how Rob had become capable of such calculated cruelty. "Jessica, I'm so sorry about everything," she said as she entered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I had no idea what Robert was planning. If I'd known, I would have tried to stop him." "I know you would have, Margaret," I replied, moved by her distress. "This isn't your fault." "When he told me about the divorce, he made it sound mutual," Margaret continued, glancing accusingly at her son. "He said you'd both realize the marriage wasn't working and were handling it maturely." "That's what I wanted everyone to believe," Rob said defensively. "I thought if I could manage the transition smoothly, we could both move on without unnecessary drama." "Without drama?" Margaret's voice rose with indignation. "Robert, you served your wife divorce papers at your anniversary dinner. You stole money from joint accounts to spend on another woman. You lied to everyone about what you were doing. How is any of that avoiding drama?" The conversation that followed was painful to witness as Margaret struggled to reconcile the son she'd raised with the man who'd systematically betrayed his marriage. She asked questions Rob couldn't answer satisfactorily and expressed horror at the evidence of his misconduct. "Where did I go wrong?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How did I raise a son who thinks it's acceptable to treat his wife this way?" "You didn't do anything wrong," Rob protested. "Marriage is complicated. Sometimes people change and grow apart." "People make choices," Margaret replied firmly. "You chose to have an affair instead of working on your marriage. You chose to steal money instead of being honest. You chose to lie instead of taking responsibility. These weren't random events, Robert. These were decisions you made." The emergency court hearing Monday morning exceeded even Pat Morrison's expectations for legal vindication. The courtroom was intimate, but the proceedings were significant. Rob arrived looking haggard with his attorney, while Ashley sat in back, with her own lawyer clearly terrified about testifying. Judge Patricia Hawkins was a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair and the authoritative presence of someone who'd spent 30 years hearing every variation of human misconduct. She reviewed Pat's evidence with methodical thoroughness. "Mr. Williams," Judge Hawkins said, addressing Rob with a penetrating stare, "the evidence suggests systematic asset concealment and financial fraud that goes far beyond typical divorce proceedings.